US and China are more similar than most people think. Both nations are living through a Gilded Age, and both are struggling to end the excesses of capitalism. US-China relations has been inflamed by narratives that emphasize and exaggerate differences between the two countries. And often this involves cultural tropes. My favorite includes the US is short-sighted, whereas China plans for 100 years. Americans value freedom, whereas the Chinese do not. America is a plutocracy, whereas China is a meritocracy. The problems of rapid industrialization and growth prompted vigorous social movements entering into the 20th century. These movements pressed for more equality, justice, and anti-corruption, and all of these movements converge into what is known as the US Progressive Era. And most historians place that from the 1900s to 1920s.
One thought that comes to mind, inherent in your this Gilded Age article and your talk here, is kind of a role of government, which goes back to your earlier books too. That there is a kind of a role for governments here, and it's kind of illuminating the whole neoliberal enterprise. But forgetting neoliberalism for a while, the role of government that I delineate from your talk is that there seems to be an accumulation stage where countries grow. In that stage, and you describe it very well in your book, How China Escaped the Poverty Trap, there is a kind of a desire to go hell-bent for investment. And therefore, you're willing to condone corruption and many other things. So you, in the accumulative stage, you want entrepreneurship at any cost, and whatever kind of entrepreneurship you can buy. And you give an example of Leland Stanford, which is a very interesting example, although we all love going to Stanford University, but nevertheless, its origins are very, very interesting. Corruption inherent in the earlier stage. When you get to a certain stage, both Roosevelt and Xi Jinping want to kind of curb the rampant robber baron capitalism and control it and kind of tame it and make it much more amenable to the social goals of a country. And then comes the third stage where state capitalism seems to have taken over, the Ronald Reagan or the Donald Trump stage, where people want to now go back and rewind the clock and go again for robber baron capitalism, and then maybe go through the cycle again. Do I read you right? Is that how you would describe it? Or is it a misrepresentation of your books?
One comment I would make is to correct the impression that the lesson from China is that developing countries should condone corruption. That would be the wrong lesson to take out of the experience. Instead, I would highlight two lessons. The first lesson from all Gilded Ages is that countries must resolutely eliminate predatory form. So no country in this world has ever prospered when embezzlement, extortion, and petty bribery is rampant. All economically successful countries must eliminate these types of corruption. So you find that in the Chinese history as well as in the American history, when we say that these are very corrupt economies, it is a particular form of corruption. It is grand, collusive, transactional corruption among elites to buy favors. We're not talking about embezzlement or petty bribery. So that's lesson number one. No question about that. The second lesson is a more subtle one, which is it's not the case that we should condone corruption. In the case of the Chinese Gilded Age, corruption served as informal rewards for growth promotion. Instead of thinking about condoning corruption, what developing countries should be thinking about is how can they create the right incentives for growth promotion, which does not necessarily have to involve corruption. If you use corruption as a reward, it necessarily comes with many risks that will accumulate over time. And I don't think it's advisable if you haven't even solved the first step, eliminating predatory corruption, to start thinking about how to leverage corruption as a development incentive, right? So do the practical thing first. Know that you absolutely have to eliminate predatory forms of corruption. You also need to align political incentives so that it is rewarding for politicians to build, to invest, and to attract businesses. But even the best of cases, the America and the Chinese case, you've seen that the outcome is not happily ever after. It is really hard to do development and governance because there are no perfect outcomes. I provide a framework for 4 types of corruption. And this is just a quick summary for those who are not familiar with the framework. The first 2 types are petty theft and grand theft. So you can think of grand theft as embezzlement. And these are like toxic drugs. They are absolutely damaging to any economy, brings no benefit to anyone. Third category is speed money. So these are petty bribes paid to low-level officials to overcome red tape and harassment. That I compare to painkillers. It helps you to get rid of hindrances, but it does not help you grow muscles fast. And the fourth category, which you had mentioned, is called access money. What the name suggests is capitalists in this case, they are not buying just speed, they're buying access. They're buying lucrative privileges that will help them to make huge profits. What is the difference in the Chinese and American Gilded Ages? The difference is not that these countries do not have corruption. The difference is that these countries are dominant only in the category of access money, but they have eliminated or they take a resolute effort to eliminate the first 3 forms of corruption. On the whole, these countries are actually highly pro-business. And China is the best example of that. I have good news and bad news for developing countries today. So the bad news is that around about 40 years ago, the path to growth was a clear formula, but difficult to implement. But the formula was clear, and that is carry out export-driven mass industrialization that required a state with high capacity to plan and build infrastructure. And that was the path that you saw in East Asia and in China. That path, the formula was clear, but it required political will. It required the capacity to implement. Today, developing countries, if they want to replicate that path, the formula is no longer clear because the geopolitical environment has shifted. You have rising protectionism. We no longer reside in this world of globalization, right? Where developing countries are welcome to come on board and be the factories of the world. We also have other constraints like climate and environment, where you can no longer replicate the path of pollute and then clean up later. So the bad news is that you can't just blindly try to replicate the growth path and the formula that have been tried and tested in the last 50 years. The good news, on the other hand, is that there are new opportunities that never existed in the past. And those new opportunities come from technology. Technology has provided unprecedented opportunities for emerging economies to leapfrog. We are seeing some unusual economic growth paths in the modern day. Do not take simplistic binary answers from the Chinese experience or from the American experience. Any kind of extreme solutions never work. The real solutions that work in the world are always in the middle. They're always about hybridizing. What we need more knowledge of for policy making is the varieties of hybrid solutions that have existed in the world and how policymakers can make their own hybrids based on the unique cultures, histories, and conditions in Pakistan, and not fall for the simplistic trap of binary solutions.